Dismissive avoidance behaves differently enough from the more anxious, more visibly conflicted forms of avoidant attachment that generic advice about this broader topic often misses the mark entirely when applied here, sometimes making things worse rather than better. Someone dismissive is not typically caught in an obvious, visible war between wanting closeness and fearing it. Their system leans considerably further toward genuine, practiced comfort with distance, toward an actual, sincere belief that independence serves them better than intimacy usually does. Understanding this specific difference changes everything about what actually works here, and applying strategies designed for a different avoidant subtype often backfires considerably when the person you are actually dealing with operates according to this particular, more self-sufficient pattern instead. Let's talk about what genuinely distinguishes dismissive avoidance from the more visibly conflicted forms this broader topic usually addresses, because this distinction matters enormously for everything discussed throughout the rest of this exploration. Dismissive avoidance tends to involve a considerably more thorough, considerably more successful suppression of attachment needs, to the point where the person experiencing it often genuinely believes, consciously and sincerely, that they do not need closeness the way other people seem to need it. This differs meaningfully from fearful avoidance, where genuine longing for closeness coexists visibly with genuine fear, producing the kind of obvious push and pull pattern many popular discussions of avoidant psychology focus on primarily. Let's talk about why this distinction matters so significantly for what actually motivates eventual commitment. Strategies built around demonstrating safety to reduce fear, useful for the more visibly conflicted fearful pattern, often prove considerably less effective here, since the primary obstacle is not acute, visible fear requiring soothing, but rather a genuinely different underlying belief system. One that has successfully convinced itself that deep commitment offers relatively little value compared to maintained independence. This means the actual work required involves something closer to gradually revealing genuine value and connection, rather than primarily reducing fear that, in this specific subtype, often does not present as visibly or as acutely as it does in other avoidant patterns. Let's talk about the first principle worth understanding for this specific subtype, something worth calling demonstrated non-necessity, referring to the counterintuitive value of not appearing to need the relationship excessively, since dismissive avoidant people often respond considerably better to partners who clearly possess full, satisfying lives independent of the relationship than to partners whose visible investment suggests the relationship represents a significant portion of their overall well-being and overall identity. This differs somewhat from how demonstrated autonomy functions for other avoidant subtypes, since here it addresses something more specific, their genuine, sincere respect for self-sufficiency, which extends to genuinely valuing partners who model that same self-sufficiency convincingly. Let's talk about why this principle requires particular care in how it gets applied, since performed independence, offered strategically rather than authentically, tends to be recognized relatively easily by someone whose entire worldview places considerable value on genuine self-sufficiency, precisely the quality they would notice being performed inauthentically. Genuine, authentic investment in your own full, separate life, pursued because it genuinely serves your own well-being rather than as calculated strategy, represents the only version of this principle likely to actually register as credible and actually produce the intended effect here. Let's talk about a second principle worth understanding, something worth calling minimal emotional processing demand, referring to the specific value of not requiring extensive, frequent emotional discussion or extensive verbal processing of the relationship's dynamics, since dismissive avoidant people often experience this kind of frequent emotional processing as genuinely draining and genuinely unnecessary, considerably more so than fearful avoidant people typically do. This does not mean avoiding genuine, necessary conversation about real issues when they arise, but it does mean resisting the temptation toward frequent, ongoing meta-conversation about the relationship itself, its meaning, its trajectory, and its emotional texture. Conversation that tends to feel, to someone dismissive, less like intimacy building and more like unnecessary, exhausting labor. Let's talk about why this particular principle often runs directly counter to instinct for many people navigating this specific relationship, particularly people whose own attachment style involves genuine comfort with, or even genuine need for, frequent verbal processing of relational dynamics. Recognizing that your own comfort with frequent processing does not necessarily match their own genuine preference matters considerably, since insisting on frequent processing specifically because it serves your own comfort, without accounting for their genuinely different relationship to this kind of conversation, tends to produce exactly the kind of exhaustion and eventual withdrawal this entire exploration is attempting to help you avoid. Let's talk about a third principle worth understanding, something worth calling value demonstrated through shared activity rather than shared emotional disclosure. Referring to the specific way dismissive, avoidant people often experience and build genuine connection considerably more comfortably through doing things together than through extensive emotional conversation. This reflects something important about how this specific subtype typically experiences intimacy, often considerably more readily accessed through practical partnership, shared competence, and companionship built around mutual activity than through the kind of verbal, emotionally focused intimacy that other attachment styles often prioritize as the primary vehicle for building closeness. Let's talk about why understanding this preference matters so significantly for how you might actually approach building genuine connection with someone dismissive. Rather than assuming that genuine intimacy must be built primarily through deep, frequent emotional conversation, considering activities, shared projects, and practical partnership as equally valid and often more comfortable, Pathways Toward Genuine Closeness offers a considerably more effective approach here than insisting on emotional conversation as the primary or exclusive route toward building the relationship's depth. Let's talk about a fourth principle worth understanding, something worth calling respect for genuine self-narrative, referring to the specific importance of not directly challenging or attempting to dismantle their own sincere belief in their independence and their own self-sufficiency, even while gently offering alternative experiences that might gradually inform that belief over considerable time. Direct confrontation of this self-narrative, insisting explicitly that they actually do need closeness more than they believe, tends to produce defensive reinforcement of the very belief you are attempting to shift, rather than genuine reconsideration. Let's talk about why gentler, more experiential approaches tend to prove considerably more effective than direct argument here. Beliefs. This central to someone's self-concept rarely shift through being told directly that they are mistaken. They shift gradually through accumulated lived experience that quietly complicates the belief without ever directly attacking it, allowing the person holding the belief to reach their own gradual reconsideration rather than feeling cornered into defending a position that has just been directly challenged. Let's talk about a fifth principle worth understanding, something worth calling patience with delayed emotional disclosure. Referring to the specific timeline dismissive avoidant people often require before genuine emotional vulnerability becomes accessible, a timeline that frequently extends considerably longer than what other attachment patterns might require, sometimes requiring years rather than months before genuine, consistent emotional openness develops reliably. This extended timeline reflects the depth of the suppression this specific subtype typically involves, suppression that took considerable time to develop and that similarly requires considerable time to gradually soften. Let's talk about something crucial regarding how these 5 principles interact with each other throughout an actual, ongoing relationship with someone dismissive. Demonstrated non-necessity establishes the foundational respect for autonomy this subtype particularly values. Minimal emotional processing demand removes a source of exhaustion that often accelerates withdrawal. Value demonstrated through shared activity provides an alternative, more comfortable pathway toward genuine connection. Respect for genuine self-narrative avoids triggering defensive reinforcement of exactly the belief you are hoping will gradually shift. Patience with delayed disclosure ensures realistic expectations regarding how long this entire process genuinely requires. Let's talk about something important regarding what these principles are not meant to accomplish, since clarity about their genuine purpose protects against misapplying them towards something considerably less healthy than genuine, respectful relationship building. None of these principles suggest suppressing your own genuine needs entirely or accepting a permanently limited, permanently superficial relationship simply because that happens to feel more comfortable to someone dismissive. Genuine partnership ultimately requires reciprocal vulnerability, reciprocal emotional intimacy, and reciprocal investment, even if the pathway toward building that reciprocity looks somewhat different here than it might with a different attachment pattern. These principles describe an effective pathway toward eventually building genuine depth, not a permanent accommodation of its absence. Let's talk about something worth naming honestly, regarding how to distinguish genuine progress from a relationship that remains permanently, comfortably superficial, without ever actually developing the depth these principles are ultimately meant to help build. Watch for whether the shared activities and the respected autonomy gradually produce increasing, if still measured, emotional openness over time, versus whether these same elements simply remain stable at a superficial level indefinitely, without any discernible movement toward greater vulnerability, even across considerable time. The former represents genuine, if gradual, progress. The latter suggests these principles, however faithfully applied, may not be producing the deeper transformation genuine, lasting partnership ultimately requires. Let's talk about something worth considering regarding the specific role of professional support for someone dismissive specifically, since this subtype often proves particularly resistant to seeking therapy or other forms of dedicated psychological support, precisely because their genuine, sincere belief in their own self-sufficiency often extends to genuine skepticism about needing this kind of outside help at all. If they do eventually engage with therapy, this often represents a particularly significant sign of genuine internal shift, since it requires directly challenging their own core self-narrative regarding their own independence and their own self-sufficiency in a way that few other actions within this specific pattern typically require. Let's talk finally about what genuine, lasting commitment from someone dismissive actually tends to look like once it does eventually develop. Distinct from the more visibly emotional, more visibly expressive commitment other attachment patterns might produce. Commitment here often continues expressing itself somewhat differently than popular romantic narratives typically portray, through reliable, practical partnership, through genuine, if measured, loyalty, through consistent presence that may never become as verbally or as emotionally expressive as you might have originally hoped for, but that nonetheless represents genuine, durable commitment within the specific relational language. This particular attachment pattern tends to speak most naturally and most authentically. Let's talk about something worth exploring further regarding a specific communication pattern that tends to work considerably better with someone dismissive than the more emotionally expansive communication style other attachment patterns often respond to favorably. Direct, concise, practical language tends to land considerably better here than lengthy, emotionally elaborate explanation, since dismissive avoidant people often experience extensive emotional elaboration as overwhelming or even as slightly performative, preferring instead clear, straightforward statements of need or concern that respect their own preference for efficiency and their own general discomfort with prolonged emotional discourse. Let's talk about why this preference for directness deserves careful, respectful application rather than being mistaken for coldness or lack of genuine care on your part. Adjusting your own communication style to favor clarity and relative brevity does not mean suppressing genuine feeling or pretending difficult emotions do not exist. It means expressing those genuine feelings in a format more likely to actually be received and actually be processed by someone whose own psychology tends to experience lengthy emotional elaboration as depleting rather than connecting. This adjustment reflects genuine attunement to their specific needs, not compromise of your own authentic emotional expression. Let's talk about something worth naming regarding a sixth principle worth understanding, something worth calling humor and lightness as connective tissue, referring to the specific value dismissive avoidant people often place on shared humor and shared lightness as a genuinely comfortable, genuinely accessible form of connection, considerably more accessible to them than intense, serious emotional conversation often proves to be. Building genuine rapport through shared jokes, shared playful teasing, and general lightness of interaction often provides a pathway toward genuine bonding that feels considerably safer and considerably more natural to someone dismissive than more overtly serious, more overtly emotional forms of connection typically feel. Let's talk about why this principle matters considerably for how you might think about the overall texture of your relationship with someone dismissive, since in relationship built exclusively around serious, weighty, emotional conversation, without sufficient balance of genuine playfulness and genuine lightness, risks feeling considerably more exhausting and considerably less sustainable to this specific subtype than a relationship that successfully balances genuine depth with genuine ongoing lightness and shared enjoyment. Let's talk about something worth exploring regarding a seventh principle, something worth calling respecting their own pace for physical and sexual intimacy. Since dismissive avoidant people sometimes navigate this dimension of relationship somewhat differently than other attachment patterns, occasionally using physical intimacy as a more comfortable substitute for emotional intimacy, sometimes conversely finding physical closeness similarly threatening to emotional closeness, and requiring similar patience and similar respect for their own developing comfort level. Understanding which pattern applies to your own specific situation, rather than assuming physical intimacy automatically indicates or automatically requires corresponding emotional intimacy, offers useful, practical insight for navigating this specific dimension of the relationship with appropriate nuance. Let's talk about something important regarding a specific risk worth naming directly: the risk of becoming so thoroughly adapted to their particular communication style and their particular preferences that your own genuine needs gradually become invisible within the relationship, a risk this exploration would be incomplete without addressing directly. While adjusting your communication style and respecting their particular preferences represents genuinely useful strategy, this adjustment should never require the complete suppression of your own authentic needs for deeper emotional connection, deeper verbal intimacy, or whatever else genuinely matters to your own well-being within a healthy partnership. Genuine, sustainable adaptation involves finding a workable middle ground, not unilateral accommodation that erases your own genuine relational needs entirely. Let's talk about something worth considering regarding how to communicate your own needs, even while respecting their particular preferences discussed throughout this exploration, since these two goals are not actually contradictory despite initially seeming to be in tension with each other. This might involve naming your own need for occasional, if not frequent, deeper emotional conversation, directly and clearly, framed as a genuine, specific request, rather than a general demand for constant emotional processing. Someone dismissive who understands specifically what you need and understands that this need is bounded and reasonable rather than open-ended and potentially overwhelming, often proves considerably more capable of meeting that specific, clearly defined need than they would be of meeting a more vague, more expansive expectation for constant emotional availability. Let's talk about something worth exploring regarding how long you should reasonably continue applying these principles before expecting to see meaningful, if gradual, evidence of increasing depth and increasing commitment developing over time. Given the extended timeline discussed earlier throughout this exploration, patience genuinely needs to extend across a considerable period, often measured in years rather than months, particularly for dismissive patterns that developed over a lifetime of successful practiced self-sufficiency. This extended timeline deserves honest acknowledgement, protecting you from prematurely concluding that these principles are failing simply because visible progress remains slow, while also protecting you from indefinite, unbounded patience that never produces any meaningful evidence of movement at all. Let's talk finally about something worth holding as central throughout this entire process: the recognition that even the most patient, most respectful, most well-calibrated application of everything discussed throughout this exploration does not guarantee that someone dismissive will eventually develop the full capacity for reciprocal emotional intimacy that genuine, lasting partnership ultimately requires. Some dismissive patterns, particularly those developed through especially significant early experience, may require considerably more support, considerably more time, or considerably more dedicated therapeutic work than even the most ideal relational environment alone can reasonably be expected to produce. Holding this possibility honestly, alongside genuine hope for the gradual progress these principles are designed to support, represents the most balanced, most realistic way to approach this entire process. Let's talk about something worth naming regarding an eighth principle, something worth calling avoiding the trap of interpreting calm as disinterest, since one of the more common, more damaging misreadings people make when navigating relationships with someone dismissive involves assuming that their genuinely calm, genuinely measured demeanor indicates a lack of genuine investment or genuine feeling. This misreading often produces exactly the kind of anxious pursuit and anxious pressure this entire exploration has been cautioning against, driven by a mistaken belief that visible, dramatic emotional expression represents the only legitimate evidence of genuine care. Someone dismissive often expresses genuine investment through consistency, through reliability, and through practical partnership, rather than through visible emotional intensity. And learning to recognize and value these quieter forms of expression protects you from unnecessarily escalating pressure in response to a calm that may actually reflect genuine security rather than genuine indifference. Let's talk about something worth exploring regarding how to distinguish, honestly, between this kind of genuine, secure calm and actual concerning indifference, since these two states can sometimes look superficially similar despite representing entirely different underlying realities. Genuine, secure calm within someone dismissive typically still includes reliable follow-through, genuine effort during moments that matter, and gradual, if slow, willingness to engage more deeply over time. Actual indifference typically lacks this underlying reliability and this underlying trajectory, instead reflecting genuine lack of investment that no amount of patience or no amount of respectful accommodation will eventually resolve into something deeper. Watching for this distinction, reliability and gradual trajectory versus genuine absence of either, offers a more accurate way to evaluate what you are actually dealing with than surface-level calm alone can provide. Let's talk about something worth considering regarding a ninth principle, something worth calling building genuine friendship as the relationship's foundation, since dismissive avoidant people often report considerably greater comfort and considerably greater longevity within relationships that developed genuine friendship, genuine shared interest, and genuine mutual respect before or alongside romantic intensity, rather than relationships that moved quickly into intense romantic and emotional territory without first establishing this kind of steadier, more practical foundation. If your relationship with someone dismissive lacks this kind of genuine friendship foundation, deliberately investing in building it through shared interests, shared humor, and genuine mutual respect independent of romantic intensity often strengthens the relationship's overall durability and overall capacity to eventually support deeper emotional intimacy as well. Let's talk about something worth naming honestly regarding your own emotional experience throughout this entire extended process. Since applying all of these principles consistently, particularly across the extended timeline this specific subtype often requires, represents genuinely demanding, ongoing work, deserving of real acknowledgement rather than being treated as simple or effortless. It is entirely natural to feel occasional frustration, occasional exhaustion, and occasional doubt about whether this patient, respectful approach will ultimately produce the depth of connection you are genuinely hoping to build. These feelings deserve compassionate acknowledgement, and maintaining your own support system, your own outside sources of emotional processing and emotional validation, remains essential throughout this entire extended process, precisely because the relationship itself may not always provide the same level of emotional processing you might receive from friends, family, or your own therapy. Let's talk about something final worth exploring regarding how you might know, with reasonable confidence, whether continued investment in this specific approach remains genuinely worthwhile for your own life, distinct from simply continuing indefinitely without any honest evaluation of whether genuine progress is actually occurring. Periodically, honestly assessing whether the relationship shows gradual, if slow, evidence of increasing depth, increasing vulnerability, and increasing reciprocity over meaningful time offers a genuinely useful check against either premature discouragement or indefinite, unexamined patience that never confronts whether this specific relationship genuinely offers the foundation required for the kind of committed partnership you ultimately deserve. Let's talk about one last consideration worth naming before this exploration concludes. The reminder that these 9 principles work best when they emerge from genuine understanding and genuine respect for who this person actually is, rather than from a purely strategic mindset focused exclusively on producing commitment as an end goal, regardless of what actually serves the relationship's genuine health. Someone dismissive, despite their genuine comfort with independence and their genuine preference for the communication styles discussed throughout this exploration, still deserves to be loved as their whole, complex self, not simply managed according to a set of techniques designed to overcome their defenses. Holding this distinction clearly protects the entire process from sliding into something closer to manipulation than genuine, respectful relationship building. Let's talk about a final brief summary worth holding together as a single, unified picture before this exploration closes. Demonstrated non-necessity establishes respected autonomy. Minimal emotional processing demand removes exhausting pressure. Value through shared activity offers an accessible pathway to closeness. Respect for genuine self-narrative avoids defensive reinforcement. Patience with delayed disclosure sets realistic expectations. Directness in communication meets them where their comfort actually lives. Humor and lightness provide connective tissue. Respecting their pace with physical intimacy honors their own timeline. Friendship as foundation builds durability beneath everything else. Together, these 9 principles offer a genuinely coherent, genuinely respectful approach considerably better suited to this specific attachment pattern than generic advice built around a different underlying psychology entirely. Let's talk about one more consideration worth naming before this exploration truly concludes: the reminder that these principles were never designed to erase the genuine differences between you, only to help those differences coexist productively, rather than repeatedly producing friction neither of you fully understands. If your own attachment style leans considerably more toward wanting frequent verbal processing, frequent emotional expression, and rapid relational depth, some ongoing negotiation between your own genuine needs and their genuine preferences will likely remain a permanent, ongoing feature of this relationship, even once genuine trust and genuine commitment have developed. This is not evidence of failure. It reflects the ordinary, expected reality of 2 people with different underlying attachment patterns, building a life together, a reality every mixed attachment relationship eventually has to navigate in its own way. Let's talk too about something worth holding regarding your own growth throughout this entire process, distinct from whatever growth eventually develops on their end. Learning to communicate directly, to tolerate a slower pace toward emotional depth, to find genuine satisfaction in shared activity rather than requiring constant verbal reassurance, represents real, valuable growth in its own right. Expanding your own capacity for flexibility and your own capacity for patience in ways that will likely serve you across many areas of your life, well beyond this specific relationship. Whatever happens with this particular partnership, this growth remains genuinely yours to keep. Let's talk about one final, closing reflection worth carrying with you, regardless of how this specific relationship ultimately unfolds. Patience of this depth and this duration is genuinely demanding, and choosing to extend it deserves to be a fully conscious choice, revisited honestly from time to time, rather than something you simply drift into indefinitely, without ever pausing to ask whether it continues serving your own genuine life and your own genuine happiness along the way. What remains true, regardless of how faithfully you apply these principles, or how long the entire process genuinely requires, is that dismissive avoidant commitment develops through a genuinely different pathway than other attachment patterns typically require. One built more around respected autonomy, shared practical partnership, and patient gradual accumulation of evidence than around frequent emotional processing or explicit verbal reassurance. Understanding and honoring this specific pathway, rather than applying generic strategies better suited to different underlying patterns, offers considerably more realistic hope for genuine, lasting commitment, should their own internal capacity for that commitment continue developing alongside your own patient, genuine effort throughout this entire process.